Hi, everyone. I am Jessica Barnes. I'm the director of Outer Banks Forever. We are the nonprofit partner of the national parks of the Outer Banks, including Wright Brothers National Memorial. And I'm really excited to be here today with a couple of my friends, new and old friends. And we are talking a little bit about maybe an untold story or unrecognized story about the Wright brothers, and that is their connection to their sister, Katherine. So being Women's History Month, we thought this would be a great time to highlight Katherine's story and dive a little deeper into her connections to the legacy of aviation. So I am excited to have Mackenzie here with me from Dayton. So Mackenzie, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Thanks, Jessica. My name is Mackenzie Whitmer, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Aviation Heritage Area, which is a program administered by the National Park Service. And I'm headquartered in Dayton, Ohio, the home of the Wright brothers. And it's a privilege to work with our friends in North Carolina and Outer Banks Forever. And I'm happy to be here today and talk about Katharine Wright.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Yes, if you have been following over the past year, it's been an exciting time. Mackenzie and I have gotten to work together along with a couple of other local partners, the First Flight Society and both of our national parks here in North Carolina and Dayton, to sort of bridge the gap between the story of the Wright brothers in Dayton and North Carolina. And that's been a lot of fun. And so we're excited today to have another special guest with us, Harry Haskell. Harry, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Harry Haskell, and I am Katharine Wright's step-grandson, and I'm speaking to you from coastal Connecticut, but I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and lived there for many years, and that is where Katharine Wright moved after she married my grandfather in 1926. So this is a bi-coastal or whatever. We have multiple points of reference here in this conversation.
That's great. And Harry, we're really excited to have you here today. As you said, you have a direct connection to Katherine and her story. And you also recently launched a podcast called In Her Own Wright that talks a little bit more about that story. So could you just tell us a little bit about your connection to Katherine and maybe some of the stories about the relationship between your grandfather and Katherine that you heard growing up?
Sure. Katherine and I have kind of a commonality in that we are both the youngest of 5 children in our families. I being a boy, she being a girl, of course. We had somewhat different experiences, but I like to think that that gave me at least a point in common with her long before I was actually aware of who she was. I grew up, many years after Katherine's death, and indeed, I never knew my grandfather. He died in 1952. I was born a couple of years later. So what I picked up growing up was largely anecdotal, and but it was also founded in an extraordinary series of letters that we had in our household growing up. They were in a box in the library in our house. And these were Katharine Wright's love letters to my grandfather that she wrote in the early 1920s as their relationship was becoming more intimate. They had known each other for many years, but after my grandmother's death in 1923, Katharine and grandfather became closer and grew steadily closer until their marriage in 1926. At these love letters, my older sisters assured me very confidently that these were just a bunch of mush, that I wouldn't be interested in them in the slightest. And I think they were probably right. For most of my childhood, I would not have been interested in them. But about 15 years ago, in the course of writing a book about my grandfather's era at the Kansas City Star. He was the editor of the newspaper for a quarter of a century, and indeed during the time that he and Katherine were married. In the course of researching that book, I took these documents out because they're now in my possession. I have the originals. They've all been microfilmed, and readers who are interested can consult them at a variety of places around the country, at the Smithsonian in Washington, at Wright State University in Dayton, and at various other repositories. But I had the originals, and I lived with them for a while as I was writing this book about my grandfather and the star, and discovered that they weren't just love letters. Of course, they were very much love letters, and they were extraordinarily passionate and revealing love letters on a deeply personal level. But they were also just full of factual information. So anybody who wants to know anything about the Kansas City Star in the 1920s would do well to look at these letters. Anybody who wants to know about Oberlin College in the 1920s, when Katharine was on the board of trustees, will get a lot of inside dope from Katharine's letters, because these are very unguarded, unfiltered letters that gave me a sense of a woman who was much more than Wilbur and Orville's kid sister, who just gets, kind of a walk-on part in most histories of the Wright brothers. And she was certainly much more than my grandfather's second wife. Of course, we know her as Katharine Wright Haskell, which is as she is formally known. But most of your fans and people in both of your areas will know her as Katharine Wright. And I'll say one interesting thing that I picked up from her letters, which gives an indication of how far in advance of her time Katharine was. She wrote to a friend after she moved to Kansas City that she actually hesitated before changing her name. And the reason she gave was very interesting. She said, well, I'm moving to a new town, and I was well aware that I could have traded on the right name. I think those are the terms, that was the word she used. At any rate, she was aware of the value of the right name, moving to a new place. But ultimately, she decided that wasn't who she was. In fact, she was embracing her new identity as my grandfather's wife. And so about a year after that, after her marriage, she finally had new letterhead designed, but she waited an entire year after moving to Kansas City, which shows that she was quite an independent-minded woman and very aware of both her place in history and her needs as an individual, which makes her what I think of as a paradigmatic new woman of the early 20th century, someone who really was in the forefront of creating a new persona for herself and for women in general.
I remember in your podcast, and forgive me, I don't remember which episode, there was also the point being made that, and I'd be interested in your opinion on this, that Katharine was sensitive to what her brother might read about her in the papers. If she kind of traded on the name Katharine Wright in Kansas City. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, yes. Well, this is the backstory that some of your listeners may not have be intimately aware of, but of course I am. Katharine and my grandfather, and I'll just call him Harry for short. So we have Katharine and Harry, and they met at Oberlin College as undergraduates in the 1890s. They weren't in the same class, but they were good friends there. And my grandfather was already engaged to another woman, my grandmother. And so he and Katharine remained just good friends for that time. And as I mentioned earlier, their relationship didn't start to hot up until after my grandmother died in 1923. Well, by that time, Katharine had been living with her brother Orville at Hawthorne Hill, the family home in Dayton, for a good decade. This was after Wilbur's death. And she and Orville were so close that people who visited the house sometimes mistook them for man and wife. And Katharine herself refers in her letters to her relationship with Orville as being that of a husband and wife. And she at one point said, you know, I had all the advantages of being married, but none of the disadvantages, which I think is also a very telling comment about her. But when she left Dayton and married my grandfather, Orville wrote her out of his life. He cut her off very abruptly, and some might think cruelly. He refused to attend the wedding. He refused to allow the wedding to be held at Hawthorne Hill. He refused to have invitations sent out. The whole thing. He was deeply, deeply hurt by what he regarded as a personal betrayal on Katharine's part. And this had a very specific origin in that he felt that there was an implicit agreement on the part of the three siblings, himself, Katharine, and Wilbur, to remain unattached and always available to each other as a kind of a team, a family unit. So Katharine, when she followed her heart and married my grandfather and moved to Kansas City, in his eyes, abrogated that. Katharine remained deeply sensitive to Orville. She had hesitated for months, close to 16 months, before accepting my grandfather's proposal of marriage. And this is a period that I deal with in my book, Maiden Flight, which is an attempt to recreate, using as many of their own words as possible, the experiences that Katharine, Harry, and Orville had during this extremely emotionally fraught period. But after moving to Kansas City, Katharine, this was a period when 1928 was the 25th anniversary of the first flight. So there was a lot of to-do around the country. There was a lot of to-do over Orville's decision to send the original Wright flyer to the Science Museum in London, because the Smithsonian, in its infinite wisdom, was still trying to have it both ways, trying to recognize the Wright brothers for their, by that time, indisputed accomplishment, and also carve out a place in history for one of their former secretaries, a man named Samuel Langley, a very distinguished aeronautical engineer, who had spectacularly failed to get a plane up in the air just a few days before that iconic first flight that we all know about in 1903 in the Outer Banks in Kitty Hawk. So Katharine was sitting in Kansas City thinking, well, it would really not help matters. I'm still hoping to see Orville again. I'm still hoping that we can patch things up. And anything I can do to just keep out of the limelight, to avoid irritating him, and those were the words she used, will be to the better. Now, in the end, it was unavailing because nothing she did could really patch that relationship up. But I'll just say, and I'm running on perhaps a bit here, but there is also another little thorn in Orville's side that Katharine was very much aware of. And that was the rumor that had been started largely in France when they were abroad in 1909. And Katharine had gone abroad with Wilbur and Orville to help basically market the Wright flyer in Europe. Because they hadn't gotten a lot of interested takers, particularly from the US government. So they decided to cast their net wider. And Katharine spoke French. She was very personable, very outgoing. And she was very much the hit of that parade when the Wrights went abroad. To such an extent that the French, who love a good story, started saying that Katharine must have had something to do with the scientific work, the mathematical work that went into the creation of the airplane. And it stood to reason because neither the boys had been to college, and she had been to Oberlin. She had a degree. She had taught at the high school level, so she was reputed to be the academic in the family, and therefore it stood to reason that she must have had something to do with that. Besides, it made a very good story. And Katharine spent the last of her life trying to live that one down and to squash it. And indeed, Orville spent the rest of his life trying to squash it. As late as, I believe, 1946, I've read a letter in which Orville is making, this was 17 years after Katharine died. And Orville is still saying to a correspondent, She was a devoted sister. She helped us in many ways, but she did not have anything to do with the invention of the airplane. So this is all the backstory to that coda to Katharine's life, and indeed the coda to Orville's career, which is in many ways quite sad and in many ways quite revealing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we hear bits and pieces about Katharine's life. I think you're right. Is particularly the trips overseas and how influential she was there and popular. And you've touched on the fact that she was college educated, which her brothers were not. So again, very much ahead of her time. So, and you mentioned, so you wrote a book, and I think that was a few years ago that your book came out. But just recently, we've mentioned that you started down the podcast route and launched this 3-part podcast called In Her Own Wright. So tell us a little bit about what motivated you to do this podcast, and then also what do you hope that listeners get from these episodes and sort of this deeper dive into Katharine's life?
Well, I've been acutely aware that as a man, I'm an odd person to be fronting Katharine's story, as it were. I felt for a long time this is a story which needs to be embraced by women, told by women, given a perspective that women have that I necessarily don't have, although I hope I've made some efforts to try to get inside Katharine in a way that perhaps some of the Wright brothers biographers and other scholars have not been able to do. So in writing my book, as I mentioned earlier, I tried to use as many of Katharine's words as possible. And fortunately, she was a prolific letter writer, not just to my grandfather, but to many others. So there were many words of hers to use. And in creating this semi-fictionalized memoir of her marriage to my grandfather and the break with Orville, I was really able to get inside her in a way which I thought opened up some very interesting lines of inquiry, some very interesting approaches to understanding who Katharine was as a woman in her time, not just as a member of the Wright family. So you take this story outside of Dayton, outside of the immediate context of aviation history, and it resonates in many ways with different people in different ways. And so the podcast is a deliberate attempt to bring more people into the conversation, specifically women. And I've in addition to having dramatic readings from Katharine's letters as part of the podcast, which sort of punctuate the various segments of the podcast, I interviewed 9 people from Katharine's great grandniece, Amanda Wright Lane, who now lives in Columbus, but is well known to people in both the Outer Banks and in Dayton. To members of the National Park Service, historians, a woman who is a retired U.S. Air Force historian with a keen interest in Katharine, a woman's historian who's done work on Katharine's role in the suffrage movement and in the women's movement in general. And one thing that's of particular interest to me, because I'm a classicist, I had a degree in Greek and Latin, which is basically what Katharine studied at Oberlin. And it's been well known for many years that Katharine loved teaching Latin in the Dayton public schools at the high school level. But I wanted to dig a little deeper in that and find out, what did it really mean for Katharine in 1908, 1909 to give up that career and join her brothers in Europe and essentially become their partner. And she was actually paid, by the way, when she went to Europe. They made up her salary in high school. So this was if you will, a contractual relationship, a business relationship, as well as a personal one for her. So I was able to talk to a classicist who has done extensive work on women in the field of classics, and discovered really what Katharine's expectations might have been, what might have drawn her into the field, how she might have perceived herself and her prospects as she established an identity that was separate from her family. All the time she was working at Steele High School in Dayton, she was living at home. But she was also very much becoming aware of the wider world and her own needs, her own capabilities as a highly competent professional woman. This is a part, again, that is a part of the story that has been acknowledged, but usually in passing. So these areas, her relationship to the Wright Company, what actually did she do within the Wright Company? And here I speak to the leading historian of the Wright Company, who is with the National Park Service, and he was able to give some very fine-grained detail on exactly what Katharine's role was after the airplane was invented and the brothers were trying to monetize their invention, and how Katharine was of assistance to them in that regard. And then finally, I spoke to a novelist, a wonderful novelist named Laurie Notaro, who's written a book about early women aviators, and asked her to imaginatively help us recreate Katharine's own first flight, which happened to take place in the south of France in 1909. First time she went up in an airplane with her brother Wilbur at the controls. And she wrote precisely one sentence, I think three or four words about that experience, to my knowledge. I can't quote them right now, but they were, basically, wow. But Laurie was able to, again, put some flesh on that story and say just how gutsy Katharine was to go up in there, because it was an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do for man or woman. And Katharine didn't need to do it, you might say. In fact, she didn't do it very often. I think she only went up twice. And it's an interesting thing that Orville also stopped flying pretty much after his accident, which had prompted Katharine to give up her job and go and join them. So I'm thinking that the podcast, it's my hope that the podcast will open up some areas of Katharine's life that might have remained a bit obscured or in the background before, that it will put together some of these scholars and other people who are coming to her from different angles, and encourage them to pool their knowledge and their perspectives and their resources. And it all part of an ongoing and very long-term project to re-envision Katharine Wright, to take her, if you will, outside the shadow of her brothers, and have her seen very much in her own right. And there's only so often we can say that. I'm sorry that pun is overused, but it's justified in this case.
I appreciate how you've shared your creative process and interviewing a wide variety of scholars for the podcast following the book. In doing that, you've shared some things that you've learned. You shared that you learned more about her role with the Wright Company factory, or what it might mean to be a woman who studied the classics, to study Latin, teach Latin. But I wanted to ask you, were you particularly surprised by anything you learned in this process, or talking with a wide variety of scholars who may or may not be in consensus about the story?
Surprised perhaps would be too strong. Okay. There are things that I had suspected, and when you live with someone as long as I have lived with Katharine, and although I'm by no means a scholar of every aspect of her life. I didn't present myself as that. I'm simply someone who is trying to put together a narrative that makes sense and that has wonderful suggestive possibilities for following. I'll give you one instance, Mackenzie, of something that where my interviewees differed strongly, and that has to do with her relationship with my grandfather, and which is, of course, a central interest to me. I don't expect that to be a central interest to other people, but I do expect Katharine's experience in navigating these relationships, these two essential relationships in her life, to be something that will resonate with many, many people. And indeed, this is very much the theme of the new opera, which Dayton Opera has just premiered, called Finding Wright, which is very largely built around Katharine's relationship with Harry, with my grandfather, but which sees it through the eyes of a contemporary woman who has certain commonalities with Katharine, the issues that she's dealing with, the feelings that she's experiencing and trying to sort through. And the composer and librettist, Laura Kaminsky and Andrea Fellows-Feinberg, have done a very creative job of trying to empathize on the one hand and analyze on the other with Katharine's experience. And so getting back to her relationship with grandfather, now, as I say, he was a widower, and he was clearly somebody who was deeply attached to the women in his life. He married 3 times, so he did marry a 3rd time after Katharine's death. He was a newspaper editor, a very active and highly respected member of the journalistic profession, in his way, as eminent, I suppose, as Wilbur and Orville were in theirs, in a very different field. But when he decided that Katharine was the woman he wanted to spend, at that point, the rest of his life with, he began a kind of a campaign, an epistolary campaign, writing her letters, because he was living in Kansas City, she was still in Dayton. They would meet up from time to time at alumni events in Oberlin. And we don't know exactly what happened at commencement at Oberlin in 1925, but it's very clear that he popped the question and basically told Katharine he was in love with her then, and it just sent her into a complete tailspin, and that was something that precipitated a lot of agonized soul searching on her part. It's clear to me, and I think clear to a number of other people, that she had been dissatisfied with her life as Orville's consort, his stay-at-home, live-in, all-purpose, helper, companion. She wrote his letters. She handled his social calendar. She did just about everything. She ran the household, and she was very vocal to many people in saying that she wanted, that she was not, it was not clear to her that this was all life had to offer her. So by the time grandfather came along, she had, I think, inured herself to this life. And at the same time, she was vaguely stirred by misgivings, dissatisfactions, which would occasionally erupt, actually, in bursts of ill temper or, catty comments about other women. All of this is well attested and documented in the letters. But where my interviewees disagreed, of course, is precisely what Harry did in all of this. Was he the sort of knight in shining armor who came along just at the right time, and boy, Katharine was going to find eternal happiness with him? Or was he, as one of my interviewees says, a pretty selfish guy who simply couldn't abide living without a woman in his life, much as Orville couldn't adjust to that, and therefore put Katharine in a very difficult, agonizing position. So I must say that one or two of my sisters has come around to that view as well of my grandfather. I think my own reading is very different, and there are other people on the podcast who take a different view. But I think it's symptomatic of Katharine's story that it is so rich, and that her own personality is so full of freely acknowledged contradictions and depths that she was partly aware of, and partly she seemed to be very unaware of many of the things that she was feeling and even doing, the way she presented herself. I think that this is one of the things that makes her a ripe subject for contemplation, for inspiration, for just asking the kind of fundamental questions that we all have to confront at a certain time. And she's exceptional not only because of who she was, a member of a very exceptional, iconic family, but because of how she was constituted temperamentally and her extraordinary ability to get her thoughts and emotions down on paper. I've often said that these letters it's like she had a direct line from her heart and her head to her hand. There's just no sense that she is filtering or censoring herself. And yet at the same time, her letters come out as, the most thoughtful, at the same time, thoughtful and spontaneous. So they are documents that really illuminate the human condition in a way that is rare in many ways. So I've given you just one example of things that I learned, but I certainly had not been aware of really what Katharine's professional orientation might have been, and how she might have actually made that a career had she chosen to remain in it. That came as something of a surprise to me. I also had not thought of her as having, physical courage in quite the way that Laurie Notaro said, which is, of course, something perhaps we might have taken for granted with her brothers. I mean, certainly they risked life and limb every time they went up in an airplane. But Katharine was cut out of the same cloth, and she was obviously somebody who was their equal in many ways. Laurie thinks that she would have made a superb aviatrix had she, which is the term that was used for a woman aviator at the time, of course, had she chosen to go into that profession. But she didn't. She had other interests, and so I think that's all of these things give a rounder picture of Katharine as somebody who supported her brothers, but also stood apart from them.
I think it's very interesting to me to hear, like you were saying, how she was able to express herself through her writing. And I think it really lends itself to thinking of Katharine in a way that's different than, we think of her as an educator. Those of us who know a little bit about her story, you mentioned, being part of the women's movement, but also having this creativity that her brothers are often sort of touted for their creativity and innovation. But that was definitely something that she also had as part of her life. It may have looked different in the way that it was presented. But what I also think is interesting, and what we've touched on a little bit today, is how today we are now telling her story in these innovative ways. So, creating a podcast to me is a new technology. That's a new way to tell this story and to explore this story. And I love that you were able to bring in so many different perspectives on the story to sort of get other, potentially differing views of interpretations of, her letters or her work, which I think is great. I also, when I heard about the opera, I know operas are certainly not a new school way of storytelling, but to me, I think, a modern opera it takes a lot of creativity. It takes a lot of thought in how you put something like that together to tell this story. So sort of bringing us back to sort of today's times. Last year, as you know, the NASA Ingenuity helicopter took flight on the surface of Mars, and they not only named that part of Mars Wright Brothers Field, but in the media, it was really touted as a Wright Brothers moment. And it was very exciting, obviously, for both us here in North Carolina and Ohio to see this sort of story elevated and make the connection between this first flight and what we've been able to do in aviation since then, which really was not that long ago. So I'd love to hear, just sort of, now that you know Katharine a little bit more intimately, just knowing more of her story, what do you think Katharine would have thought about the Mars Ingenuity and now Wright Brothers Field on Mars? Do you think that they had any thought around space travel when they were really just at that time trying to get us off the ground here on planet Earth?
It wouldn't surprise me in the least. I think that, for them, really, the stars were the limit. I think once they made that conceptual leap, which others are much better equipped than I am to describe, it is really a quantum leap in the human imagination. Grandfather referred to Orville as one of the most, I've forgotten the words he used, but actually just one of the great creative geniuses in all of history. And presumably he felt the same way about Wilbur. I think that they had at the very beginning very practical ideas about what their invention was going to lead to. And in some ways, they were ideas that were circumscribed by their own experience in their times. For example, we think of World War I and the horrific role that aircraft played in World War I. Well, Orville, who was very involved in the aircraft. Advising the government on aircraft production and the uses of aviation, had initially seen aircraft as a benign force, indeed limiting the destructive capability of warfare because they would be used principally for reconnaissance, and they could therefore reveal an enemy's troop movements and prevent the kind of mass slaughters and surprise attacks that had, come into the fore in late 19th century warfare. But of course, all that was blown out of the water. So there were many things which he didn't foresee. But remember, he lived until 1948. So he lived into the atomic age. And it's absolutely certain to me that he, and had Katharine also lived that long, that they would have embraced the new technology and yet at the same time, like so many people who were involved in at the highest echelons of scientific endeavor at that time, have foreseen its capacity for ill as well as good. So when we get a right moment like this on Mars, where it's indisputably, just a wonderful moment for celebrating the benign side of this technology that Orville and Wilbur unleashed with Katharine's help. I think that they very much, although they couldn't have, I think, envisioned the specifics of it, none of this would have surprised them at the end of their lives. They had lived through so much. I mean, they were born, for heaven's sakes, in a horse and buggy era. And I think of Katharine in particular as being very much a Victorian woman who became a 20th century woman. And it was an act of will, in part, because she understood, as her brothers did, that the old ways simply wouldn't work anymore. That society had to move forward for the betterment of society, not just for the joy of discovery, not just science for science's sake, art for art's sake, but because it had very practical bearing on the way society functioned. And it's often, we don't talk a lot about the Wright family's politics, but they were actually very extraordinarily progressive for their day. And I think all of them, all of the three younger siblings, Katharine, Wilbur, and Orville, would certainly have welcomed and not been at all surprised by the age of interplanetary exploration. What they would make of Elon Musk going up in his own private rockets, I'm not sure. I think I have, I think I have some ideas, but obviously this is just it's a frontier that continues to recede in front of us and seems to be, unlike many frontiers, effectively limitless.
One thing that, a final thought on some of the tensions that you just referenced that are further explored in both the podcast and the book, are the tensions between, the Victorian era and the onslaught of the progressive era, and the tensions that Katharine had there. And then you just referenced the political progressiveness of their attitudes, but then at least in some framework, the restraint of the faith that they grew up in, even if they didn't carry out that faith their whole life. And so I appreciate you exploring some of those tensions and the complexity and the depth of Katharine's life. What would you, just as a last thought, how do you think Katharine's life and legacy, how can that speak to us today?
Well, I think very much from my perspective, and I think the women I spoke to in the podcast have slightly different takes on this, but for me, it is precisely those contradictions in Katharine's character. The feeling that she needed to be rooted in the old ways. And for her, those old ways were largely expressed by the values of Oberlin College, not so much her father's old-time religion, which she was ambivalent about. And the same was true of my grandfather. He was ambivalent about his missionary parents' religion and broke off, eventually became a Unitarian. In fact, that was a source of some twitting on Katharine's part when she moved to Kansas City. But I think the need she felt to have a grounding, a firm grounding in values, which were perhaps not immutable, but were certainly very, very strong. And yet to remain open to the kind of serendipitous experiences and the forces of modernity which were propelling her world forward. And I often think of, the Wright brothers, that flight really did as much as any single event to usher in the modern age in this country. And I think that is one reason why that flight has lingered, why that first photograph, the photo of the first flight, has become so iconic. It stood for so much more than just getting up in the air for X number of seconds. And then, a few years later, making a machine that could actually stay up and carry passengers and all that. So Katharine's the two sides of her personality, constantly in tension, constantly checking. She was constantly checking herself. And with each step she took forward, she was asking herself, is this consistent with who I am? Are the values that I am embracing in this particular instance those that I feel society needs moving forward? So the composer and librettist of the opera Finding Right have presented Katharine, or at least they do in the podcast, perhaps more than in the opera, as an activist, as somebody who, were she alive today, would be embracing any number of causes that were suited to her temperament, but that she would be very much in the forefront of issues, contemporary issues. So I think that, and when I asked them essentially the question that you asked me, Mackenzie, their answer was that she was involved. She was a contributing member of society who always felt that she had more to offer than simply within the walls of her home. So that old cult of Victorian domesticity, which in many ways she spent her life observing. She looked after her family as few women have done. I mean, she had great challenges from a very early age and sacrificed a great deal. And yet at the same time, she was absolutely determined for her own sake, and I think in solidarity with other women, although she might not have put it quite that way, because I'm not sure that she thought of herself as a feminist, but she clearly was conscious of blazing a trail. And the trails that need to be blazed for women or for others today are different trails. There are different issues involved, but the fundamental strength of character and the fundamental combination of temperamental characteristics that it takes to address these issues, I think, is very much the same. And that is why Katharine, I think, will remain a figure who inspires and we continue to learn from.
That's great, Harry. Thank you so much. I think this has been a really great overview of just some of the things I think people don't know about Katharine Wright. Like I said, I think we all, being somewhat involved in the Wright brothers story, all three of us, we like to make sure that all the points of these stories are told. And so this was a great way for us to celebrate Women's History Month, learn a little bit more about Katharine. We will put links below this video to the podcast episodes so folks can dive into those a little bit more and hear more about the great conversations that you mentioned today. So Harry, I know I want to say thank you. I'm sure Mackenzie and I this was a lot of fun for us to get to do. So thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And Mackenzie, anything else you want to add before we sign off?
Oh, I could just keep on going, but for the sake of our audience, I will say just a thank you to Jessica at Outer Banks Forever for organizing, and thank you, Harry, for your work and for your time this morning. I have a lot of ideas going on in my head right now.
Excellent.
So what she's saying is you may be hearing from us again. So Mackenzie and I, that's what our ideas do. They grow into fun things throughout the year.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much.